Tonight, before dessert is served, my son will finally do the right thing and get married. Linda Carter announced to the table, her voice bright and confident, as if she were revealing a birthday surprise instead of a decision that no one had asked Ethan Carter to make. The dining room fell into a strange silence that didn't quite match the warm glow of the chandelier above the long oak table. Ethan stood just inside the doorway, still holding his car keys, trying to understand what he had just heard. The smell of roasted chicken and fresh rosemary filled the air, and the polished dishes reflected the light like it was any other Sunday family dinner in suburban Ohio. But something about the room felt wrong. Ethan's eyes moved slowly across the table, taking in details that hadn't been there before. His mother sat at the head of the table, smiling in a way that suggested everything was already settled. His father, Richard Carter, sat beside her with a satisfied expression, arms folded as though he had been waiting for this exact moment. Across from them sat Madison Clark, dressed far more formally than anyone would expect for a casual dinner. Her pale blue dress looked almost ceremonial under the dining room lights. Ethan had met her only twice before through his parents at a neighborhood fundraiser. Yet tonight, she sat there quietly with her hands folded in front of her plate, as if she belonged in the center of something important. Then Ethan noticed the man seated near the end of the table. The stranger wore a dark suit and a small silver cross on his lapel, and a leather binder rested neatly beside his plate. The moment Ethan saw it, his stomach tightened. Even before anyone spoke another word, he recognized what that binder meant. The man offered a polite smile and nodded toward Ethan. "Good evening," he said calmly. "I'm Pastor Daniel Brooks." Ethan blinked slowly, still standing near the doorway, his mind trying to catch up with the scene unfolding in front of him. Pastor. Binder. Madison in a formal dress. His mother watching him like she was waiting for applause. Linda Carter clasped her hands together as if she were proud of a job well done. "Sit down, Ethan," she said gently. "You're just in time." Ethan walked to the empty chair that had clearly been saved for him, noticing that the place sitting in front of it included a folded card with his name written neatly in his mother's careful handwriting. The entire table looked staged, like a photograph waiting to happen. Even the candles had been arranged perfectly down the center of the table. Ethan sat down slowly, glancing again at Madison. She gave him a nervous smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. No one touched the food. No one reached for their glasses. The air felt heavier with every passing second. Richard cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. "Your mother, and I thought it was time to help you move forward with your life," he said. Linda nodded quickly. "You've been drifting long enough, Ethan. Tonight we're giving you the opportunity to build a real future." Ethan looked from his parents to the pastor, then back to Madison, and the realization settled over him like cold rain. This wasn't a celebration. It was a plan. And somehow, everyone at the table except him already knew how it was supposed to end. The room stayed quiet long enough for the ticking of the old kitchen clock to become the loudest sound in the house. Ethan Carter rested his hands on the edge of the table and looked carefully at the people sitting around him, trying to understand how a normal Sunday dinner had turned into something that felt rehearsed. The roasted chicken in the center of the table was still steaming, the mashed potatoes untouched, the bowls of green beans perfectly arranged as if someone had spent hours preparing the scene. His mother had always believed that presentation mattered. Linda Carter leaned forward with a warm smile that would have looked comforting to anyone who did not know her well. "You look surprised," she said gently, as though she had expected nothing else. Ethan did not answer right away. Instead, he turned his eyes toward Pastor Daniel Brooks. The man sat calmly with his hands folded beside the leather binder, his expression patient and professional, like someone waiting for the start of a scheduled event. Pastor Brooks gave a polite nod again, the kind of nod people give when they assume everyone else in the room already understands what is happening. Ethan felt the strange pressure of everyone's attention settling on him. Madison Clark shifted slightly in her chair across the table. She smoothed the front of her dress and looked down for a moment before meeting Ethan's eyes again. Her smile was careful, uncertain. She looked less confident than Ethan's parents did. Richard Carter reached for his glass of iced tea and took a slow sip before speaking. "Your mother and I have spent months thinking about this," he said calmly. "We wanted to give you a proper beginning." Ethan looked at him. "A beginning to what exactly?" Richard set the glass back down. "A beginning to your marriage." The words hung in the air as plainly as if they had been written on the wall. Ethan turned his head slowly toward Madison again, studying her face for any hint that this was some kind of misunderstanding. She did not laugh. She did not correct his father. Instead, she folded her hands together and kept her eyes on the tablecloth. Linda Carter reached across the table and gently slid a small velvet box toward the center. The movement was slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. Ethan stared at the box without touching it. His mother spoke again, her voice soft but firm. "We know you would never take the first step on your own, Ethan. So we helped." The words were said with the confidence of someone who believed she had solved the problem. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, trying to process the scene unfolding around him. The candles flickered quietly between them. The pastor cleared his throat politely and opened the leather binder, flipping it to a marked page with calm efficiency. It looked exactly like the beginning of a ceremony. Ethan looked around the table once more. His father sat upright, satisfied. His mother watched him closely, waiting for gratitude. Madison remained silent, her shoulders tense. Pastor Brooks adjusted his glasses and looked toward Ethan with a professional smile. "Whenever you are ready," the pastor said gently, "we can begin." The quiet that followed the pastor's words felt heavier than the moment before. Ethan Carter did not move right away. He sat there studying the open binder in front of Pastor Daniel Brooks, the neat printed pages that looked prepared for vows that had never been discussed with him. The candles on the table flickered gently, and the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen drifted into the dining room, making the silence feel even more uncomfortable. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes and looked at Madison Clark again. She was still sitting across from him with her hands folded together, her shoulders slightly tense as if she was waiting for something important to happen, but was not entirely certain it would. Ethan noticed that her water glass had not been touched either. In fact, no one had taken a single bite of the carefully prepared dinner. Everything about the evening felt staged, like a scene waiting for the main actor to read the correct line. Linda Carter leaned forward with the calm patience of someone who believed she had already solved the problem in front of her. "There is no need to look so worried," she said gently. "We arranged everything so that it would be simple." Ethan looked at the velvet box again, sitting quietly between the plates. The small object seemed to carry the weight of the entire evening. He rested his hands together on the table and spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. "I do not remember agreeing to any of this." His voice was calm, but the sentence caused a small ripple of tension around the table. Richard Carter shifted slightly in his chair and gave a small dismissive wave of his hand. "You did not need to agree," he said. "Sometimes a family has to help a person make the right decision." Ethan turned his head toward his father. The statement hung in the air like a rule that had been decided long ago. Madison finally lifted her eyes again and glanced briefly at Ethan before looking back down at the tablecloth. She looked uncomfortable now, as though she had just realized that the evening might not unfold the way everyone had expected. Pastor Brooks adjusted his glasses and spoke with polite professionalism. "Your parents explained that this was a special gathering to unite two families," he said calmly. "I assumed the details had already been discussed." Ethan gave a quiet breath through his nose and leaned back slightly in his chair. He studied the room again, noticing the extra chairs placed along the wall, the neatly folded napkins, the carefully arranged candles that his mother had likely spent the afternoon positioning just right. None of it had been done by accident. Everything had been prepared for a ceremony that Ethan himself had never agreed to attend. Linda Carter reached toward the velvet box and gently opened it. Inside rested a simple gold ring that reflected the candlelight in a soft, steady glow. She turned the box slightly toward Ethan as if presenting proof that the evening was already complete. "You have spent years avoiding commitment," she said quietly. "Tonight we are simply helping you begin the life you should already have." Ethan looked from the ring to Madison and then back to his parents. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and the silence slowly began to stretch across the room again. Then he leaned forward just slightly and asked a question that no one at the table seemed prepared to answer. "Did anyone here think to ask what I wanted?" For a few seconds no one spoke after Ethan Carter asked the question. The dining room felt smaller somehow, as if the walls themselves had leaned closer to hear the answer. Linda Carter's smile did not disappear, but it tightened slightly at the edges, the way a person smiles when they believe patience will solve everything. The candles between the plates continued to burn steadily, and the smell of rosemary and roasted chicken drifted quietly through the room, a reminder that this evening had originally been presented as nothing more than a family dinner. Richard Carter leaned back in his chair and folded his arms across his chest, studying his son with the calm certainty of a man who believed the outcome had already been decided long before Ethan walked through the door. "What you want," Richard said slowly, "is not always what is best for you." The sentence landed with the quiet weight of something he had said many times before in other situations throughout Ethan's life. Ethan did not immediately respond. Instead, he looked again at Madison Clark. Her posture had grown more rigid, and she now held the edge of her napkin between her fingers as if she needed something small to anchor her attention. She looked toward Ethan again for a moment, then toward Linda Carter, as though silently asking which direction this conversation was supposed to go. Linda spoke again before anyone else could respond. "You have spent too many years drifting," she said calmly. "Your father and I simply decided it was time to stop waiting." Ethan rested his elbows lightly on the table and studied the gold ring still resting inside. The velvet box. The candlelight reflected off its smooth surface in a quiet circle of light. Everything about the object suggested permanence, commitment, a life decision that had apparently been made without the person expected to wear it. Pastor Daniel Brooks shifted slightly in his chair, sensing the tension growing in the room. He kept his voice professional and even. "If there has been a misunderstanding," he said carefully, "we can certainly take a moment to clarify the intentions of everyone involved." Ethan looked at the pastor with a calm expression. "I appreciate that," he said. Then he turned back to Madison. His voice remained steady, not accusing, simply direct. "Did anyone ask you what you wanted either?" Madison's fingers tightened slightly around the napkin. She hesitated long enough that the pause itself began to answer the question before she even spoke. When she finally looked up, her expression carried a mixture of embarrassment and uncertainty. "Your mother explained that this was something you had been considering," she said quietly. Ethan's eyes shifted slowly toward Linda Carter. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Linda did not look embarrassed. Instead, she gave a small, patient sigh, the kind that suggested the conversation had become unnecessarily complicated. "Sometimes people need encouragement," she said. "If we had waited for you to organize your own future, we might still be sitting here 10 years from now having the same conversation." Richard nodded in agreement beside her. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair and looked around the table once more, seeing the evening clearly for what it was becoming. The carefully arranged dinner, the waiting pastor, the ring placed exactly in the center of the table. None of it had been spontaneous. None of it had been a celebration. It had been a plan, built piece by piece, designed to leave him with only one acceptable answer. And for the first time since he walked into the room, Ethan realized that the people who had built that plan were now waiting to see whether he would follow the script they had written for him. The silence after Ethan Carter's realization stretched slowly across the dining room like a storm cloud that no one wanted to acknowledge. For a moment, no one reached for their plates or their glasses. The food continued to cool quietly on the table, untouched, while the gold ring inside the velvet box sat exactly where Linda Carter had placed it, gleaming softly under the candlelight. Ethan watched his parents carefully, studying their expressions the way someone studies a puzzle that suddenly begins to make sense. The calm certainty in his father's posture and the quiet patience in his mother's smile told him something important. They had expected resistance. They had prepared for it. Linda Carter rested her hands neatly together and spoke again in the calm tone she often used when explaining something she believed should be obvious. "You are thinking too much about the details," she said. "What matters is that everything is already here. The pastor is here. Madison is here. Your father and I are here. Sometimes life works better when a decision is made for you." Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair and let out a slow breath. The sentence sounded less like advice and more like a rule that had shaped his entire childhood. Across the table, Madison Clark shifted again, her chair making the faintest sound against the wooden floor. She looked toward Ethan with a hesitant expression, as if she had begun to understand that the evening was moving into unfamiliar territory. Pastor Daniel Brooks closed the binder halfway, sensing that the atmosphere in the room had shifted from anticipation to something much more uncertain. He spoke gently, choosing his words carefully. Marriage is usually strongest when both people arrive at the decision freely, he said. His voice was polite, but there was a quiet firmness beneath it. Richard Carter responded immediately, as if the comment had been unnecessary. Young people often hesitate when they should simply move forward, he said. Commitment is easier once the first step is taken. Ethan listened to his father's words and then looked again at the gold ring resting in the open box. The object now seemed less like a symbol of a future and more like a prop in a performance that had been carefully arranged. He folded his hands together on the table and spoke in the same calm tone he had used all evening. You planned this, he said quietly. Linda did not deny it. Instead, she nodded once, almost proudly. Of course we did, she replied. A family sometimes has to guide things in the right direction. Ethan glanced around the room again. The extra chairs along the walls suddenly made more sense. The formal table setting. The candles carefully arranged down the center of the table. Even Madison's dress, elegant and deliberate, fit perfectly into the scene that had been designed. It had never been a dinner. It had been a stage. Madison looked toward Linda again, her voice quieter now. Mrs. Carter, she said carefully. You told me Ethan already knew about tonight. The statement landed gently but clearly. For the first time, Linda Carter's expression changed slightly, though the smile remained. She turned her attention back to Ethan with calm confidence. We knew you would hesitate, she said. But hesitation does not mean the answer should be no. Ethan looked at her for a long moment without speaking. The calm tone in the room remained, but beneath it something had shifted completely. The plan that had seemed so certain only minutes earlier now sat in the center of the table beside the untouched dinner, waiting to see whether Ethan Carter would follow the script his parents had written or decide to change the ending entirely. The quiet tension in the dining room continued to thicken as Ethan Carter remained seated, his eyes resting calmly on the small velvet box in the center of the table. The gold ring inside reflected the candlelight in slow flashes that made the entire situation feel strangely unreal. No one had touched the food yet, and the roasted chicken that had looked so carefully prepared an hour earlier now seemed like an afterthought in a room that had been arranged for something entirely different. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes from the ring and looked at Madison Clark again. She seemed more uneasy now than she had at the beginning of the evening, her posture stiff and her fingers lightly gripping the edge of the tablecloth as though she was trying to steady herself. The confidence that had once been present in Linda Carter's voice still lingered in the room, but even she had begun to sense that the plan she had constructed was not unfolding as smoothly as she had imagined. Ethan spoke again, his voice measured and calm. So the entire evening was organized without a single conversation with me. The sentence was not loud, but it carried a clarity that forced everyone at the table to listen carefully. Richard Carter leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table as though he was addressing a business negotiation rather than a family matter. You have always delayed important decisions, he said evenly. Your mother and I decided that waiting longer would only make things worse. Ethan nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the statement rather than accepting it. Across the table, Madison looked toward him again, and for the first time her voice entered the conversation without hesitation. I believe this was something you had already talked about with your parents, she said quietly. They told me you simply preferred not to make a big announcement until tonight. Ethan turned his head toward his mother. Linda Carter met his gaze with the same composed expression she had maintained throughout the evening. She did not appear embarrassed or uncertain. Instead, she spoke with the steady assurance of someone who believed the outcome was still inevitable. If we had told you ahead of time, she said, you would have found a reason to avoid the evening entirely. Pastor Daniel Brooks shifted slightly in his chair again, his professional calm beginning to show signs of discomfort. He closed the leather binder gently and placed his hands on top of it, signaling that the ceremony he had expected to conduct was no longer certain to happen. Perhaps we should pause for a moment, he suggested carefully. It may be helpful for everyone to confirm that this is truly what both individuals want. The suggestion hung quietly in the room. Richard Carter exhaled slowly through his nose, clearly irritated by the hesitation that had begun to take over the dinner. Young people today spend too much time questioning decisions, he said. Marriage used to begin with families bringing two people together. That is exactly what we are doing tonight. Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. Then he leaned forward slightly, and rested his hands on the table. A marriage begins with two people choosing it, he said calmly, not four people arranging it. The sentence settled over the table with quiet finality. Madison lowered her eyes again, and Pastor Brooks looked between the two young adults with growing concern. Linda Carter remained silent for a moment, her smile fading just enough to reveal that the certainty she had felt earlier in the evening was beginning to weaken. The dinner she had planned as a celebration was slowly turning into something she had not anticipated at all. The stillness in the dining room deepened after Ethan Carter spoke, his calm voice leaving a quiet echo that seemed to settle into the walls of the house itself. The candles flickered gently along the center of the table, casting small moving shadows across the plates and glasses that no one had touched. Ethan sat upright, his posture relaxed but steady, as if the tension filling the room belonged to everyone else except him. Across the table, Madison Clark slowly lifted her eyes again. The uncertainty in her expression had grown clearer now, replacing the polite composure she had carried earlier in the evening. She looked toward Linda Carter, then toward Richard Carter, as if silently asking whether the evening was supposed to continue the way they had originally described it to her. Linda Carter took a slow breath and straightened slightly in her chair, adjusting the sleeve of her sweater with the careful precision she often used when regaining control of a conversation. "Ethan," she said calmly, "you are treating this like a confrontation when it was meant to be a gift." The word gift hung in the air with a strange weight. Ethan turned his head slightly toward his mother. His expression remained thoughtful rather than angry. "A gift usually comes with the option to decline it," he replied quietly. Richard Carter gave a short exhale through his nose, clearly losing patience with the direction the conversation had taken. He leaned forward again, placing both hands flat on the table. "You are 34 years old," he said firmly. "Most people your age are already building families, buying homes, raising children. Your mother and I are simply helping you move toward the life you keep postponing." Ethan listened carefully, then slowly looked back toward Madison Clark. She had grown noticeably more uncomfortable now, her shoulders slightly tense and her gaze shifting between the people at the table. Ethan spoke gently, directing his words to her rather than to his parents. "Did they ever tell you that we had actually agreed to this tonight?" Madison hesitated. The pause stretched long enough to make the answer clear even before she spoke. "They said you were ready," she admitted softly. "They said you just did not like planning public announcements." Ethan nodded once, absorbing the statement without surprise. He turned his attention back to Linda Carter. "So the plan depended on everyone believing something that was never discussed with me." Linda's expression tightened slightly, though she still held on to the calm confidence that had guided the evening from the beginning. "Sometimes a situation needs a little encouragement," she said. Pastor Daniel Brooks cleared his throat quietly and folded his hands on top of the closed binder in front of him. His voice remained respectful, but the hesitation was now unmistakable. "I must say that I usually meet with couples together before performing a ceremony," he explained carefully. "It helps ensure that both individuals feel comfortable with the commitment they are making." The room grew quiet again. Ethan glanced once more at the gold ring inside the velvet box. The symbol that had once represented the center of his parents' carefully planned evening now looked oddly small sitting alone between the plates. After a moment, Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair and spoke in the same steady voice he had used all night. "Then perhaps the most honest thing we can do right now," he said, "is admit that this evening started with a misunderstanding." The words settled gently across the table, but their meaning carried a quiet force that none of the carefully arranged candles or untouched dishes could soften. The quiet weight of Ethan Carter's words lingered in the dining room, like a door slowly opening to a truth no one at the table had expected to face. The candles continued to burn steadily, their soft light reflecting off the silverware and the untouched glasses of iced tea. For the first time since the evening began, the careful arrangement of the table no longer felt like the center of attention. Instead, every eye rested on Ethan. Linda Carter remained perfectly still, though the calm confidence she had carried earlier now seemed thinner, as if the conversation had begun to slip beyond the boundaries she had carefully planned. Richard Carter shifted in his chair, clearly unsettled by the direction the evening had taken. "Misunderstanding is not the word I would choose," he said firmly. "This is a matter of responsibility." Ethan listened without interrupting, his gaze steady and thoughtful. Across from him, Madison Clark looked down at her hands for several seconds before finally speaking again. Her voice was soft, but it carried the honesty that had been missing from the evening until now. "I did not know this was a surprise for you," she said quietly. "Your mother told me you wanted something simple, something private." Ethan nodded slowly, not blaming her, only absorbing the pieces of the story as they became clearer. Pastor Daniel Brooks remained seated near the end of the table, the closed binder resting quietly beneath his hands. His expression had changed from polite anticipation to careful concern, as though he had stepped into a conversation that had nothing to do with the ceremony he had expected to perform. He glanced toward Linda Carter and spoke gently. "It might be best to give everyone time to discuss this properly before moving forward with anything official." Linda inhaled slowly through her nose, the first visible sign that the evening was not unfolding according to the plan she had imagined. She looked at Ethan with a mixture of determination and disappointment. "Your father and I believed we were helping you," she said. "You have spent years avoiding commitments that would give your life structure." Ethan rested his hands together on the table and considered her words carefully. The room remained quiet long enough that the faint ticking of the wall clock became noticeable again. Then he spoke, his voice calm and measured. "Structure only works when the person living inside it chooses it," he said. Madison looked up at him again, this time with a small nod that suggested she understood what he meant. The tension in the room shifted once more, but now it felt different. The pressure that had once been focused entirely on Ethan was beginning to spread across the entire table. Richard Carter cleared his throat, as though preparing to reassert control over the evening. But before he could speak, Ethan slowly reached forward and closed the velvet ring box with a gentle click. The sound was quiet, but it carried a clear meaning that everyone in the room understood. Ethan rested his hand beside the closed box and looked calmly at his parents. The dinner they had planned as the beginning of a ceremony now felt like the end of something else entirely. The candles still burned. The plates still sat untouched, but the script that had been written for the evening no longer had a place in the room. The soft click of the velvet ring box closing seemed to echo through the dining room longer than anyone expected. For a few seconds no one moved. The candles continued to flicker gently down the center of the table, their small flames reflecting off the polished forks and glasses, as if the room itself had not yet realized that the evening had quietly changed direction. Ethan Carter kept his hand resting beside the closed box, his posture calm and steady. Across from him, Madison Clark slowly released the edge of the napkin she had been holding, her shoulders relaxing slightly, as if the tension she had carried into the evening had finally begun to loosen. Linda Carter looked at the small box in the center of the table and then back at her son. The careful smile she had maintained for most of the night was gone now, replaced by something more complicated. It was not anger exactly, but it was no longer confidence either. Richard Carter was the first to break the silence. He leaned forward slightly, his voice firm but controlled. "Closing the box does not solve anything," he said. "You are still avoiding the responsibility that comes with being an adult." Ethan turned his head slowly toward his father, listening without interrupting. The calm expression on his face had not changed. "Responsibility is not the same thing as surrendering a decision," he replied. Richard shook his head with quiet frustration. "You are making this more dramatic than it needs to be." Ethan looked down briefly at the table, noticing again the untouched plates and the careful arrangement of food that had been prepared hours earlier. The evening had begun with the appearance of a celebration, but now it felt more like a conversation that had been waiting years to happen. Pastor Daniel Brooks shifted slightly in his chair near the end of the table. He had remained respectful and quiet for most of the evening, but the tension in the room had clearly become impossible to ignore. "Perhaps the best course of action," he said carefully, "is to pause this evening and allow everyone to speak openly without the pressure of a ceremony." Linda Carter looked toward the pastor as if she had forgotten he was still there. For a moment she did not respond. Then she exhaled slowly and folded her hands together on the table. "We invited you here because we believed tonight would bring clarity," she said. "Instead it has only created confusion." Madison lifted her eyes again and spoke gently. "I do not believe it is confusion," she said quietly. "I think it is honesty." The room fell silent again. Ethan looked at her with a small nod of appreciation before turning back toward his parents. You wanted tonight to solve a problem, he said calmly. But the problem was never my hesitation. The problem was that no one asked me what I wanted my life to look like. Linda watched him closely now, her expression thoughtful. For the first time that evening, she seemed to be studying her son rather than directing him. The quiet ticking of the wall clock filled the room again. The dinner that had been prepared so carefully still sat untouched, and the pastor's binder remained closed on the table. What had been arranged as the beginning of a ceremony now looked more like the moment a long conversation had finally begun. The quiet conversation that had slowly unfolded around the dinner table left the room feeling different than it had only an hour earlier. The carefully arranged plates, the polished silverware, and the steaming dishes that had once been part of Linda Carter's planned celebration now sat untouched, almost forgotten beneath the soft glow of the candles. Ethan Carter remained seated calmly, his hands resting lightly on the table near the closed velvet ring box. Across from him, Madison Clark sat a little straighter than before, as if the honesty that had entered the conversation had allowed her to breathe more easily. For the first time that evening, the tension in her shoulders had softened. Linda Carter studied her son carefully, her expression thoughtful in a way that had not appeared earlier in the night. The certainty that had guided her preparations seemed to have been replaced by something quieter and more reflective. Richard Carter, however, still carried the firm posture of someone who believed the evening had simply taken a temporary detour. He cleared his throat slowly and spoke again. "You keep talking about what you want," he said. "But life is not built only on personal preference. Families guide each other toward stability." Ethan listened patiently, then nodded slightly. "Guidance is not the same thing as control," he replied. His tone was steady and respectful, but the meaning was unmistakable. Pastor Daniel Brooks remained quietly attentive near the end of the table. He had placed his folded hands on top of the closed binder in front of him, and his calm presence seemed to ground the conversation in a kind of quiet professionalism. "It sounds to me," he said gently, "like this evening has become more important as a discussion than as a ceremony." Madison glanced briefly toward the pastor and then back toward Ethan. "I do not feel comfortable pretending we planned something together when we did not," she said softly. The honesty in her voice did not accuse anyone directly, but it made the situation impossible to ignore. Ethan gave a small nod of agreement. Linda Carter leaned back slightly in her chair and exhaled slowly. For the first time that evening, she looked around the table as if noticing the untouched dinner, the cooling dishes, and the long hours she had spent arranging everything earlier that day. "I believed I was helping," she said quietly. "Your father and I thought we were creating an opportunity." Ethan looked at her with calm understanding rather than anger. "An opportunity only works if the person receiving it has the freedom to accept it or refuse it," he said. The words were simple, but they settled heavily in the room. Richard Carter shifted again in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with how far the conversation had moved from the confident plan he had expected to unfold. "You are turning this into something unnecessarily complicated," he said. Ethan shook his head gently. "No," he answered. "It was complicated the moment the decision was made without me." The quiet ticking of the wall clock filled the pause that followed. Madison folded her hands calmly on the table now, no longer gripping the napkin as she had earlier. Pastor Brooks glanced once more at the closed binder and then back at the people seated around the table. What had begun as a formal moment now felt more like the first honest conversation this family had shared in years. And as the candles continued to burn slowly beside the untouched dinner, it became clear that the evening was no longer about a ceremony at all. It had become something much more revealing about the people gathered around that table. The quiet atmosphere in the dining room continued to settle into something far different from what Linda Carter had imagined when she arranged the candles earlier that afternoon. The gentle glow of the lights reflected across the untouched plates and glasses, creating a scene that looked peaceful on the surface but carried the unmistakable weight of a conversation that had shifted the balance of the room. Ethan Carter remained seated calmly, his posture steady and composed. The closed velvet ring box still rested near his hand, no longer the centerpiece of the evening, but a quiet reminder of the plan that had brought everyone to this moment. Across the table, Madison Clark looked more relaxed than she had at the beginning of the night. The uncertainty that had clouded her expression earlier had slowly been replaced by a thoughtful calm. She seemed less like someone waiting for instructions and more like someone finally allowed to speak for herself. Linda Carter watched both of them carefully, her eyes moving between Ethan and Madison as if trying to understand how the evening had changed so quickly. The confidence she had carried into the dinner had softened into something quieter, something closer to reflection. Richard Carter remained less willing to accept the shift. He leaned back in his chair with a small shake of his head, clearly frustrated by the direction the conversation had taken. "You are acting as if your mother and I did something wrong," he said firmly. Ethan turned toward him slowly, his voice measured and respectful. "I believe you thought you were helping," he replied. "But helping someone build a future is different from deciding what that future must be." The statement hung gently in the room. Pastor Daniel Brooks, who had spent most of the evening listening with quiet professionalism, nodded slightly, as if he recognized the truth in Ethan's words. His binder remained closed on the table in front of him, a silent signal that the ceremony he had been invited to conduct was no longer the purpose of the evening. Madison spoke again after a moment, her voice steady. "When your mother spoke to me last week," she said, glancing briefly toward Linda Carter, "she described tonight as a celebration that both of us had already agreed to." Linda lowered her eyes briefly, as if the admission required a moment of quiet acknowledgement. "I believed it would be easier if the evening simply moved forward once everyone was here," she said. Ethan listened carefully. He did not interrupt, and there was no anger in his expression. Instead, he spoke with a calm clarity that seemed to guide the conversation rather than challenge it. "Life decisions cannot begin with a misunderstanding," he said gently. "If they do, then the foundation is already unstable." The room fell silent again, but the silence no longer felt tense. It felt thoughtful. Richard Carter looked at the closed ring box once more, and then slowly shifted his gaze toward the untouched dinner. The food that had once been part of Linda's carefully planned celebration now seemed to belong to a different evening entirely. Pastor Brooks finally spoke again, his voice calm and reassuring. "Perhaps tonight was meant to bring something important to the surface," he said. Ethan gave a small nod, understanding exactly what the pastor meant. The evening had begun with a script written by someone else, but now the conversation unfolding around the table belonged to the people actually living it. And for the first time since Ethan had walked through the door, the direction of that conversation was no longer being decided by anyone except the people sitting there together. The quiet reflection that had settled over the dining room continued to hold the attention of everyone seated at the table. The candles burned lower now, their soft light stretching across the polished wood and casting long shadows that made the untouched dinner appear almost symbolic. Ethan Carter remained calm in his chair, his hands resting loosely beside the closed velvet ring box. What had once been presented as the centerpiece of the evening now looked small and almost irrelevant against the weight of the conversation that had unfolded. Across from him, Madison Clark sat with a thoughtful expression, her posture no longer tense but steady, as if she had finally found solid ground in a situation that had begun with uncertainty. Linda Carter watched the two of them carefully, her gaze moving slowly from Ethan to Madison and then toward the quiet presence of Pastor Daniel Brooks near the end of the table. The confidence that had guided her preparations earlier in the day had softened into something closer to contemplation. She had expected a celebration, a moment of proud resolution, yet the evening had opened a different kind of conversation entirely. Richard Carter shifted in his seat and glanced toward the untouched dishes that had once filled the room with warm aromas. The roasted chicken, the vegetables, the carefully prepared side dishes had all been part of a plan designed to support a single moment. Now they seemed to belong to a different version of the evening that had never truly existed. Pastor Brooks looked around the table with a gentle expression. "Sometimes a gathering reveals more than the people who arranged it intended," he said quietly. His voice carried the calm understanding of someone who had witnessed many important moments in people's lives. Ethan nodded slightly at the comment. "Tonight revealed something important," he said. "Not about marriage, but about honesty." The sentence settled softly into the room. Madison looked toward him and gave a small nod of agreement. "I think honesty is the only place something meaningful can begin," she said. Linda Carter folded her hands together slowly on the table. For a moment she did not speak. When she finally looked up, her voice had lost the certainty that had filled it earlier in the evening. "Perhaps we tried to move too quickly," she admitted quietly. Ethan met her gaze calmly. There was no resentment in his expression, only a quiet clarity that had grown stronger with every moment of the conversation. "It is not wrong to hope for a future," he said gently. "But the future has to belong to the people who will live in it." Richard Carter exhaled slowly, the tension in his posture easing for the first time since the dinner began. He glanced at the closed ring box once more before looking away toward the dim kitchen doorway. The conversation had carried the evening into a place none of them had planned, yet it had also brought something genuine to the surface. Pastor Brooks rested his hands lightly on the closed binder and smiled kindly at the group gathered around the table. The ceremony he had expected to conduct would not happen tonight, but something else had taken its place. The candles continued to burn softly beside the untouched dinner, and in that quiet moment it became clear that the evening had not been wasted at all. It had simply become a reminder that the most important decisions in life cannot be arranged in advance by anyone except the people who must ultimately choose them. The quiet understanding that had settled around the table did not disappear, but it began to change shape as the minutes passed. The candles were now shorter, their wax slowly forming small pools at the base of each holder, and the carefully prepared dinner had cooled completely. Ethan Carter remained seated in the same calm posture, though the tension that had filled the room earlier had faded into something more reflective. Across from him, Madison Clark glanced once again at the untouched plates before finally reaching for her water glass and taking a small sip, the first person that evening to break the strange stillness surrounding the meal. The small action seemed almost symbolic, as though the room itself had been waiting for someone to acknowledge that the ceremony which had been planned would not happen. Linda Carter watched Madison carefully and then slowly reached for a serving spoon beside the roasted chicken. Her movements were no longer precise and rehearsed the way they had been earlier that afternoon. Instead, they carried the quiet acceptance of someone who understood that the evening had become something very different from what she had imagined. "We should at least eat before everything gets completely cold," she said softly. Her voice did not carry the authority it had at the beginning of the night. Richard Carter looked at her with mild surprise, as though the suggestion of dinner had suddenly reminded him that the entire evening had originally been arranged as a family meal. Pastor Daniel Brooks gave a gentle nod of agreement. "That sounds like a wise idea," he said kindly. "Conversations are always easier when people remember they are sitting together as a family." The word family lingered in the room for a moment. Ethan glanced at Madison and then back toward his parents. The tension that had once separated everyone at the table had shifted into something quieter, something more thoughtful. Linda carefully served a portion of the roasted chicken onto Richard's plate and then passed the dish toward Ethan. For a moment he hesitated, then accepted the plate and placed a small portion on his own dish. Madison followed with a modest helping of vegetables. The simple act of sharing food began to restore a sense of normalcy that had been absent for most of the evening. Richard Carter cleared his throat again, but this time his voice was less forceful than before. "Perhaps we allowed our expectations to move ahead of the reality," he admitted slowly. Ethan looked up from his plate and met his father's gaze with calm understanding. "Expectations can be powerful," he said, "but they do not replace conversation." Madison nodded quietly at that. Pastor Brooks leaned back slightly in his chair, clearly relieved that the tension had softened into something more manageable. "Every family has evenings that reveal something important," he said gently. "The value comes from what people choose to do with that understanding afterward." Linda Carter looked down at the table for a moment, then slowly lifted her eyes again toward Ethan. The determination that had driven her earlier in the night had faded, replaced by a quieter expression that suggested she was finally listening rather than directing. The candles continued to burn softly as the family began to eat the meal that had been waiting patiently throughout the entire conversation. And although the ceremony that had once seemed certain was no longer part of the evening, the people gathered around the table were finally beginning to speak to one another with a kind of honesty that had been missing for a very long time. The quiet rhythm of dinner slowly replaced the tension that had once filled the room, though the evening still carried the memory of everything that had unfolded earlier. The clinking of forks against plates sounded almost unfamiliar after such a long stretch of conversation. Ethan Carter took a small bite of the roasted chicken and glanced around the table, noticing how different everyone looked now compared to when he had first walked through the door. Madison Clark ate quietly across from him, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested the weight she had been carrying earlier had finally lifted. She no longer looked like someone waiting for an announcement or a ceremony. Instead, she looked like a guest who had simply come for dinner and conversation. Linda Carter continued serving small portions of vegetables around the table, her movements slower and less precise than before. Earlier that afternoon, she had arranged every detail with the confidence of someone certain about the outcome of the evening. Now she seemed more thoughtful, pausing occasionally as if reflecting on the choices that had led them to this moment. Richard Carter remained quiet for several minutes, focusing on his plate while the conversation rested. Eventually, he set his fork down and looked toward Ethan. His voice, when he spoke, had lost the sharp certainty that had colored it earlier in the evening. "I suppose we believed we were saving time," he said slowly. Ethan looked up, listening carefully. Richard continued after a brief pause. "Your mother and I spent weeks discussing what we believed would make your life easier. We thought if everything was arranged properly, the decision would feel natural." Ethan considered the statement without reacting immediately. Pastor Daniel Brooks sat calmly at the end of the table, observing the exchange with the quiet patience that had guided him through the entire evening. The closed binder still rested beside his plate, no longer a sign of an upcoming ceremony, but simply an object that had witnessed the conversation unfold. Madison glanced briefly toward Linda Carter before speaking again. "When Mrs. Carter first spoke with me," she said gently, "she described tonight as a moment where two families would come together." Linda nodded slowly. "That was my hope," she admitted. Ethan set his fork down and folded his hands loosely on the table. "Hope is not the problem," he said calmly. "The problem is assuming the answer before the question is asked." The words were not harsh, but they carried a quiet clarity that everyone at the table understood. Linda looked at him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "You always did prefer to find your own way," she said. Ethan gave a small smile at that. "That is usually how people build something that lasts," he replied. The candles had burned lower now, their light softer and warmer than before. Outside the windows, the evening had deepened into night, and the house felt quieter than it had earlier. Pastor Brooks finally lifted his glass of water and spoke with a gentle smile. "It seems to me that tonight has still accomplished something valuable," he said. Richard glanced toward him. "And what would that be?" Pastor Brooks answered calmly. "It reminded everyone at this table that the strongest commitments are the ones people choose freely." The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence felt comfortable rather than tense. The dinner that had begun with expectation had slowly transformed into something more genuine. And as the family continued eating together under the dim candlelight, it became clear that the evening was no longer about forcing a future into place. It had become the beginning of understanding how that future would have to be chosen instead. The quiet rhythm of dinner continued, but the atmosphere in the room had changed in a way that none of them could ignore. The earlier tension had softened into a reflective calm, yet the evening still carried the weight of everything that had been revealed. Ethan Carter slowly set his fork down beside his plate and glanced around the table again. The candles had burned even lower now, their light softer and warmer, creating a peaceful glow across the dining room. It was almost difficult to believe that only an hour earlier the same room had been prepared for a ceremony that now felt distant and improbable. Madison Clark finished a small bite of vegetables and wiped her hands gently with her napkin before speaking again. Her voice was thoughtful rather than uneasy now. "I think tonight may have started with the wrong expectation," she said quietly. Ethan looked toward her with interest, giving a small nod that invited her to continue. Madison glanced briefly at Linda Carter before finishing her thought, but it did give everyone the chance to understand each other more honestly. Linda rested her hands together on the table, listening carefully. Earlier in the evening, she had directed every moment with certainty, but now she seemed willing to let the conversation move wherever it needed to go. Richard Carter leaned back slightly in his chair and exhaled slowly. The frustration that had once been clear in his voice had softened into something more thoughtful. "Perhaps we tried to solve a problem that did not exist," he admitted. Ethan responded calmly. "Or perhaps the problem was simply that we were not having this conversation sooner." Pastor Daniel Brooks nodded gently from his seat at the end of the table. The closed binder beside him had become almost symbolic of the evening's transformation. "Conversations often reveal more than plans ever could," he said quietly. Ethan considered the statement and then turned his attention toward his parents. You both care about my future, he said, his tone respectful and sincere. I understand that. But the future only works when it belongs to the person living it. Linda Carter studied her son's face for a moment, as though she was seeing something she had overlooked before. The determination that had once guided her actions now appeared to have been replaced by a quieter understanding. We always believed. We were guiding you, she said slowly. Ethan gave a small smile. Guidance can be valuable, he replied. But it works best when it allows someone to walk their own path. Madison nodded in agreement. The conversation now felt less like a conflict and more like a moment of reflection shared between people who were finally listening to one another. Richard Carter looked toward the closed velvet ring box, still resting near the center of the table. Earlier it had represented the outcome he believed was certain. Now it looked like a reminder that life rarely follows the exact plans people create for it. Pastor Brooks glanced toward the window where the night had fully settled outside. Sometimes an evening changes direction for a reason, he said gently. And that reason is usually understanding. The family sat quietly for a moment, each person reflecting on the unexpected path the evening had taken. The dinner that had once been arranged as a celebration had slowly transformed into something far more meaningful. It had become the moment when everyone at the table realized that the future cannot be organized like a ceremony. It must be chosen, step by step, by the people who will live it.